They say kings were chosen by God, their blood, divine, but what happens when that same blood turns against them? In the flickering light of 1,000 candles, a young monarch kneels before a priest. The crown is heavy, the air thick with incense and silence. Around him, nobles whisper of destiny, of purity, of the sacred bloodline that must never be diluted. But beneath the gold and velvet lies the cruelest irony in royal history, that the pursuit of perfection would become their greatest flaw. For centuries, Europe's monarchs ruled with one obsession: to keep their blood pure. They believed royal blood was not just a symbol of power, it was power itself. Marrying a commoner meant contaminating the divine. So they turned inward. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces. Generations intertwined like vines feeding on the same root until the fruit began to rot. At first, it seemed like control. By marrying within their own families, kings secured alliances, land, and power. A closed circle meant no betrayal. But behind the walls of their glittering palaces, something monstrous was taking shape, an invisible curse carried in their veins. The portraits from this age still hang in museums today. Flawless faces, pale skin, perfect posture. Yet, look closer. The jawlines too long, the eyes oddly distant, the expressions vacant. These were not just royal features. They were warnings written in flesh. Every dynasty believed they could outwit nature. Every generation thought their divine blood would remain untouched. But nature, silent and patient, was keeping score. It didn't care for titles, thrones, or sacred decrees. It only obeyed its own cruel law. Too much of the same blood will poison itself. And poison it did. Empires that once ruled continents began to crumble from within, their heirs stillborn, their kings mad, their queens barren. The same blood they protected became the dagger that ended them. This is not just a story of power, it is a story of obsession, of rulers so determined to remain gods that they forgot they were human. Because in the end, the crown did not pass to the strongest or the purest, but to those who survived the curse of their own creation. The story of Europe's most powerful families begins here, with the blood that built empires and the purity that destroyed them. In the grand halls of Europe, one name ruled for nearly 6 centuries: the Habsburgs. They built an empire so vast, it stretched from the silver mines of South America to the marble palaces of Vienna. Their banners carried the symbol of divine right, their bloodline the promise of eternal dominion. But behind those golden crests, a slow and silent decay was spreading, a curse born not from witches or enemies, but from the very blood that crowned them. The Habsburgs were obsessed with lineage. They believed power was a sacred inheritance, passed only through the veins of their own kind. So they married within the family, generation after generation. A niece to her uncle, a cousin to his cousin, even an aunt to her nephew. Each marriage sealed another alliance, but also another mutation in their fragile gene pool. And nowhere did the curse show itself more cruelly than in their final heir, Charles II of Spain. Charles was born in 1661, the product of nearly 200 years of relentless inbreeding. His face told the story of his ancestry before he ever spoke. His jaw jutted forward grotesquely, the infamous Habsburg jaw, so pronounced that he struggled to chew food or even close his mouth completely. His tongue was too large for speech. His body, frail and twisted, seemed at war with itself. Behind closed doors, doctors whispered that he was more specter than man. The priests called him a miracle, the last hope of a divine bloodline. But, in truth, he was its living tomb. At court, Charles sat beneath gilded ceilings, surrounded by advisors who bowed to a crown that was already collapsing. Spain, once the mightiest empire on earth, was rotting from within, bankrupt, divided, directionless. And the king, barely able to rule his own body, was expected to rule the world. He married twice, desperate to produce an heir, but neither union brought children. His blood, so carefully preserved, had finally destroyed the very thing it was meant to protect. When Charles II died childless in 1700, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty died with him. The empire that had once claimed to rule where the sun never set now fell into chaos and war. Yet the tragedy wasn't confined to Spain. Across Europe, the same tainted legacy lived on in the Austrian Habsburgs, in rulers like Emperor Leopold I and his son Charles VI, whose own children were plagued by miscarriages, deformities, and early deaths. The portraits of this dynasty remain chillingly beautiful. Kings and queens adorned in gold, their faces eerily similar, the same chin, the same pale eyes, the same empty gaze. It is as if the family's features were carved into marble, unchanging, unnatural. The Habsburgs had conquered half the world, but they could not conquer the laws of life itself. Their blood, once seen as divine, had become the empire's most lethal weapon, one that turned inward, striking at the heart of every generation. And so, beneath the shimmering crowns and marble statues, lay a story of decay, of kings who ruled over continents, yet were prisoners of their own blood. The Habsburg curse was not a myth. It was the slow collapse of a family that mistook purity for power. Their empire did not fall in battle. It died quietly, in bedrooms, in cradles, and in the twisted smile of a king who could not speak the name of his own kingdom. For centuries, royal families cloaked their marriages in divine purpose. They believed their blood was sacred, chosen by God, purified by destiny. But science would later reveal what faith could not, that the very thing they called pure was, in fact, poisoned. Inbreeding, or the repeated marriage between close relatives, doesn't just concentrate wealth and power, it concentrates genes. Hidden within every human being are silent mutations, harmless on their own, but deadly when mirrored across generations. When cousins wed cousins, those flaws no longer hide. They meet, they multiply, and they awaken. The Habsburgs were a living experiment in genetic isolation. Studies of their family tree show that Charles II's parents shared more genetic material than siblings normally would. His inbreeding coefficient, a measure of how related one's parents are, was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. In other words, nature had been pushed beyond its limits. The result was not one single defect, but an entire system collapsing. The infamous Habsburg jaw was only the most visible symptom. Behind it lay a labyrinth of disorders: infertility, immune weakness, neurological problems, and mental decline. The family's attempt to preserve its divine lineage had instead built a biological prison. And they were not alone. Across Europe, the same pattern repeated. Hemophilia haunted the descendants of Queen Victoria, a disease where blood refuses to clot, turning the smallest wound into a mortal threat. Porphyria, a rare genetic illness that causes madness and hallucinations, is suspected to have plagued Britain's King George III. Even the Romanovs, the last imperial family of Russia, carried this deadly inheritance, a curse passed down through love, not malice. Modern genetics now tells us what history hinted at for centuries. Isolation breeds fragility. The more tightly a bloodline closes itself, the more brittle it becomes. In the dark palaces of Europe, this truth was written not in science books, but in cradles and coffins. Yet in their time, kings and queens refused to see it. They didn't have the language of genes or chromosomes. To them, sickness was divine punishment, not biology. Every miscarriage was God's will. Every deformity, a test of faith. And so, generation after generation, they continued, blind to the quiet arithmetic of their own extinction. When blood becomes poison, it doesn't happen overnight. It seeps in slowly, invisibly, through marriages, through rituals, through the illusion of control. And by the time the signs appear, a trembling hand, a vacant stare, a line of heirs fading into dust, it's already too late. The science may explain it now, but back then, it was seen as something darker, a curse, a whisper that even kings could not escape the one law greater than all others, that nature always takes its revenge. Power was supposed to make them gods. Instead, it drove them mad. Behind the golden curtains of Europe's great palaces, the cost of royal blood was not just physical, it was psychological. Generations of inbreeding didn't only weaken the body, it distorted the mind. And for monarchs who ruled by divine right, madness became the final inheritance of their cursed bloodlines. Take King George III of Britain, the man who lost America. To the world, he was the symbol of English order, a stern father of empire. But in the privacy of Windsor Castle, the king's mind began to unravel. He spoke endlessly, sometimes for hours without pause. He laughed at nothing, shouted at ghosts, and once shook hands with a tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. His servants whispered of witchcraft, his doctors of melancholy madness. Today, historians suspect porphyria, a genetic blood disorder, passed silently through generations of royal intermarriage. The irony was chilling. The blood that had made George a king was the same blood that made him lose his mind. Across the continent, another monarch was sinking into his own abyss. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Mad King, was born into the same tangled network of European royalty. To the world, he was a dreamer, a romantic who built fairy tale castles like Neuschwanstein, the inspiration for Disney's Sleeping Beauty. But those who knew him saw the shadows behind the beauty. Ludwig withdrew from court, refusing to govern. He roamed the halls of his palaces alone, speaking to imaginary guests, dining in silence as invisible orchestras played for him. His ministers called him insane. The people called him cursed. And one cold night in 1886, the Mad King was found floating lifeless in a lake beside his doctor, who was also dead. No one knows what truly happened, but the curse of the bloodline lived on in his legend. A man born to rule, destroyed by the very inheritance that made him royal. This was the hidden tragedy of Europe's dynasties. Their mental decline was masked by ritual and ceremony. When kings screamed or queens fainted, the court called it divine inspiration. When they grew paranoid or delusional, it was labeled eccentricity. But behind the gilded language, madness was everywhere, a side effect of bloodlines too tightly bound, of power too long confined within the same few families. The fear of betrayal, the paranoia that someone, somewhere, was plotting to steal the throne was more than politics. It was hereditary. Generations of isolation and control had created not only fragile bodies, but fragile minds. The royal family became a mirror reflecting its own decay. The more they tried to keep their world pure, the more it collapsed inwards. Even in their portraits, the madness shows through. Eyes too bright, smiles too still, faces that seem to know more than they should. Behind every canvas was a story of confinement, of loneliness, of lives too controlled to ever feel human. They called themselves blue-blooded, a symbol of perfection and divine right. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, that phrase took on a new meaning, not purity, but pathology. The same blood that crowned them had become their cage. And as the world moved forward, revolutions rising, empires falling, the kings and queens of Europe sat locked in their palaces, haunted by ghosts of their own making. Their thrones were not toppled by swords or uprisings. They were undone by something far more intimate, the slow, invisible madness of their own blue blood. By the 19th century, the age of empires was changing, yet the curse of royal blood was far from over. The story of inbreeding had entered a new, tragic chapter, carried by one woman whose name still defines an era, Queen Victoria. To the public, Victoria was the embodiment of stability, a matriarch whose children would link the royal houses of Europe into one vast family. To history, she became the silent messenger of a genetic curse. Within her bloodline hid a mutation that would come to haunt generations: hemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood from clotting. In ordinary life, a small cut means nothing. For a hemophiliac, it can mean death. The slightest bruise can bleed internally, unseen and unstoppable. Victoria herself was only a carrier, showing no symptoms. But through her, the disease spread like a shadow across Europe's glittering courts. Her son Leopold suffered from it, a gentle prince whose childhood was spent wrapped in caution, forbidden from climbing, running, or even laughing too hard for fear his fragile veins might rupture. He died young, after a simple fall. But it was Victoria's descendants who would pay the highest price. Her daughters married into Europe's great dynasties, carrying the disease into the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia. In Russia, the gene took root in the most fateful of places, the House of Romanov. When Tsarina Alexandra gave birth to her only son, Alexei, the empire rejoiced. But soon, the celebrations turned to dread. The boy bruised easily, bled endlessly, and nearly died before his 10th birthday. His suffering became the empire's most dangerous secret. Desperate to save her child, Alexandra turned to a strange holy man, a mystic named Grigory Rasputin. He was unwashed, unsettling, yet somehow his presence seemed to calm the boy's bleeding. Whether through hypnosis, luck, or faith, Alexei's pain eased when Rasputin prayed beside him. And so the Tsarina clung to him, blindly, fiercely, even as he corrupted the royal court. The hemophilia that began as a genetic flaw now became a political weapon. Rasputin's influence over the royal family fueled rumors, scandals, and hatred that would help tear the Russian monarchy apart. In the end, the curse that had followed Europe's royals for centuries did not just claim lives, it changed the course of nations. Alexei Romanov died with his family in a cellar in 1918, the final heir to a dynasty brought down by war, revolution, and a disease passed from one queen's blood to another. It was a story written in veins, a reminder that even love, even lineage, could become lethal when bound by the illusion of purity. From the Habsburgs' twisted jaws to the Romanovs' bleeding prince, the message was the same. Royalty had spent centuries trying to make their blood divine. And in doing so, they turned it into a curse. The portraits still hang, golden frames, royal robes, faces serene and timeless. But behind those perfect features lies silence. The silence of lineages that no longer exist. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Bourbons, the Tudors, dynasties that once ruled the world now survive only in history books and museum walls. Their palaces stand like tombs, monuments to a glory that turned against itself. They did not fall in war or rebellion, but in their sleep, undone by the slow, invisible decay of their own blood. The curse of inbreeding was never sudden. It was quiet. A stillborn child here, a barren queen there, a prince too frail to ride, a king too mad to rule. Every generation lost a little more strength, a little more sanity, until their empires stood hollow, magnificent shells with nothing human left inside. And yet, for centuries, they called it divine. The very weakness that was destroying them was mistaken for holiness, a mark of distinction that set them apart from the common world. They built their own cages and called them thrones. They chained their futures to the past, convinced that purity meant power. But nature does not bow to crowns. It does not recognize divine right. It only obeys one truth. Life must change or it dies. By the dawn of the 20th century, the great royal houses of Europe began to collapse like dominoes. The Habsburgs lost their empire after World War I. The Romanovs were executed in the snow. Even those who survived, like the Windsors of Britain, quietly loosened the chains of their ancestry, marrying outsiders, breaking with centuries of tradition, trying to escape the sins of their blood. Yet the lesson they left behind is not just royal, it is human. The same obsession that destroyed them, purity, legacy, control, still lingers in us. In every society that worships perfection, in every lineage that fears change, the echo of that curse remains. Because history's most powerful families didn't vanish in a single night. They faded, slowly, beautifully, like candlelight dying in a golden room, and the world watched, believing they were eternal, until their blood told the truth. The age of divine blood ended not with war, but with nature reclaiming her throne.